Hi, Nick. Nice to see you.
Hi, Amar. Good to see you too.
Yeah. Well, everyone has got access to your bio. They've read it online. And since this is a blended conference, people tend to read the bios uh, far more than face-to-face conferences. So I'm not going to give an introduction as such. They all know who Dr. Nick Merriman is. But one thing that I have to say, I always say this, that not many people realize that Nick was a pioneer. In his PhD thesis was on non-visitors. How many years ago, Nick?
Too many. 1988, I finished it.
Yeah. So on non-visitors. And but for me, the most inspirational was when he was at Museum of London, a project called Peopling of London. You can Google it. And that everybody came to London. When we talk about inclusion, it's everybody in London. And how he and his team developed the project and how it was embedded into the local school curricula. And it became so inspirational that we sent one of our curators from Canberra to London to see the exhibition. She came back and she curated an exhibition called Canberras. Peopling of London inspired Canberrans, Rotterdammers in Rotterdam, and Copenhageners in Copenhagen. I can give you many examples. So Nick, you've been very inspirational for a lot of us over the years, and I won't say any more, just hand over to you.
Well, thank you, Amar. That's very kind of you. I'm not actually going to speak about anything to do with the Museum of London. But as you've hinted, really my whole academic and museum career has been focused on inclusion. As you indicated, my PhD was actually trying to look at why some sections of society didn't tend to visit museums and looking at the ways in which we could overcome some of the barriers. And what I want to do, I've spent my career in a combination of kind of academic posts and practical museum curatorial and then director posts, because there is often something of a division, isn't there, in museum studies between the theory of museum studies writings and the practice of people who work in museums. And often people working in museums think the gulf is rather large and that some of the things written about in museum studies are difficult to apply in practice or don't relate to their everyday work. And I've always been really concerned to try and bridge that potential divide, particularly around putting ideas about inclusion into practice and seeing them actually work. And one of the things, I'm going to give you two practical case studies now of two museums that I've been director of, one of which I'm still director of, the Horniman Museum and Gardens in London, which you can see there. And the earlier one is my first museum director role at Manchester Museum, which I'll be talking about fairly extensively because I had 12 years there. And given that my whole career has been on trying to really make inclusion happen in museums, I was also aware that many of the things that are put forward as case studies in inclusive practices are great, but they often impact on a relatively small number of people, a target audience who are given, who are perhaps not usually museum visitors and are given an intensive experience as part of a project and perhaps become converted. But generally, those kinds of inclusive practices don't necessarily have much impact on the overall statistics of museum visitation because they are participated in by a relatively small number of people. So as you can see from my title here, what has interested me in the last sort of 15, 20 years maybe, is developing mass participation by all, learning from and building on some of the great projects that include relatively small numbers of people and spreading that out so that the whole museum becomes participated in by a wide audience. And by that, I tend to take the demographics of the local population, whether it's the local city or region, whichever is appropriate, from which most of your visitors come, and trying to match those demographics in the museum's visitation patterns. So in the next just less than 30 minutes, I'm going to talk about these case studies. First of all, with Manchester Museum. Now, I hope that's advanced the slides. Please let me know if it hasn't, because I have had problems in the past. But I'll keep going and assume they are advancing unless you tell me otherwise. So Manchester Museum, a typical Victorian colonial institution, happens to be in a university, the University of Manchester, a global museum of natural history and human cultures, scholarly, very important collections, large ones, largest university museum in the UK with 4.5 million specimens. When I arrived in 2006, it wasn't quite clear. Different people said different things about what the museum is for. So one of the first things I did with the distance that a newly incoming director has of being able to look at the big picture, did some work with communities and with staff, volunteers, etc., other stakeholders on clarifying what the point of the museum is. And we came essentially that it was about promoting understanding between cultures and working towards a sustainable world. Both of those intertwined issues, focusing on, of course, the cultural and the natural history collections. And from this, and I can circulate this if people want, and I think this is being recorded, as well as having that vision you see at the top there about engagement between culture, understanding between cultures and working towards a sustainable world. I wanted to bring the staff together into a unified way of doing things. So we developed rapidly a series of values that you see on the right there about collaboration and respect, as well as being provocative and as well its corollary respectful. We developed a personality for the museum as if it's a person. In other words, this personality had to be manifest in all of the museum's communications, internally and externally, friendly, intelligent, knowledgeable. We wanted to be one of the leading university museums in the world. And the mission more broadly, as you can see there, provoke debate and reflection about the past, present and future of the earth and its inhabitants. And the central idea, as you can see there, was about engagement. And my aim was to try and shift the dial on the visitor demographics to make this museum one that was owned by the population of Manchester. When I came, like most museums, that wasn't the case. And in retrospect, it took about 10 years to be able to do this. So one of my big takeaway points for today, I think, is that to make mass participation by all a reality, it's not a quick fix. It has to be a whole organizational effort. All the organization has to work together, and it takes probably a decade, depending on what your starting point is. So I want to give you some examples of some of the practical things that we did in order to achieve that. And here are the priority audiences that we were at that time not attracting as a colonial university museum. And they won't be a great surprise. It was younger people and children, the elderly or older people, visitors from what's in the UK called socioeconomic classification C2DE, which is essentially lower and working class people, Black and minority ethnic audiences, and visitors with a disability. I mean, all museums really have these kinds of challenges. So here are some examples of the kinds of things that we set about doing to attract those audiences over the long term. So, of course, museums are ostensibly about objects, but they're really about the people. Both the people visiting and the social interactions between them and the interactions they have with the museum staff. So we invested a lot in our visitor host team, and particularly making them more diverse than they were, and representative of the local community, particularly by recruiting through the local job centre. And we also, as a university museum, had this huge resource of experts in the museum and in the university, and we did a lot of work to get them out from behind their desks and in their labs into meeting the public. So we had a really successful ongoing program called Meet the Experts, where there's a dinosaur expert on the left there and a sort of more general biology expert on the right. And it was great for the academics, of course, to be able to translate their ideas into terms that were intelligible for a more general family audience. Many museums are not particularly welcoming to the under fives, but we realized, of course, they are mostly not at school, and so they're a brilliant daytime audience. So we developed special programming called Toddler-tastic, making the museum and employing staff who are particularly trained in early years interaction and education, to make the museum particularly friendly to them. And you can see that even involved ensuring our showcases. This is a gallery that was renewed while I was there. The showcases actually go down fairly close to the floor to allow small children actually get up and see what's inside them. Handling, again, many museums pay lip service to this, but we made it a really, really big part of our offer with a very large handling collection for schools. And as you can see here, we had a small vivarium, as it's called, with reptiles and amphibians, where we had special handling sessions, particularly actually for special schools who were educating pupils often with autism and those sort of things, who were obviously not so able to swim in the mainstream education based around writing. And although it's not this girl, there was a fantastic example of a girl who hadn't spoken for over a year, who came into one of these things and was sort of shown and touched a frog, and she said, "Frog." And her parents were in tears. And it's examples like that that demonstrate, I think, the power of the museum experience of handling or direct interaction with objects, specimens, and people that can have on, in this case, one individual, but the ripples of that, of course, went far beyond. This, I should say, before you get too alarmed, is a large size model. It's not an actual insect. And again, Big Saturdays were one of the ways in which we got our experts out. This is a man with the beard is an insect expert on engaging our local, more diverse family audience. We also, as a university museum, felt it was really important for us to be innovative, particularly, as I said, majoring on this issue of handling. And of course, many of our objects are too fragile or precious to allow handling, but we had some funding through university sources to develop a haptic interface. Now, if you may know them, but if you haven't seen them before, it's rather strange to get your head around. It's essentially there on, you can see a screen on the left with the girl putting her hand inside something, and there's a kind of joystick, and you move a cursor. You can see on the right there the Greek vase, and you can move a cursor around the vase, and you feel pressure where you actually experience the outside of the vase, and you can trace its outlines and even go inside the vase. And this offers up huge opportunities for access for fragile and rare museum objects, but also, of course, for people who aren't able to travel to the object, to the museum, including people with disabilities. One of our major successes was our Inspiring Futures, IF, which was volunteering for well-being. As you'll be well aware of, cultural participation in and of itself has been shown through research to be actually extremely beneficial to the mental health and well-being of people. We targeted people who were long-term unemployed, and essentially their long-term unemployment created a vicious circle of low self-esteem, unsuccessful job applications, further knocks to self-esteem, and so on. And by working with the local job centre and taking them out of that vicious cycle, giving them training in our front of house team, mainly, where they would interact with members of the public, of course, and make them feel welcome, You can see the man there, top right. Sean was one of these volunteers who ended up actually being employed by us because he was so good at that work. And he said it got him out of that depressive cycle because it gave him a reason to get up in the morning and go out to a workplace and meet new people and be sociable. So that the importance of volunteering, both for mental health, but also for widening audiences, is, I think, very powerful. A large amount of our work also was aimed at outreach, particularly with the elderly who might not have been able to visit us. So we particularly worked with local care homes, often people suffering from dementia. And we had an extensive object outreach program, which targeted those venues. We also, amazingly to my mind, and very amusingly, developed an inflatable museum, which went out to various community halls, village halls, and even school halls. We were conscious that many communities and indeed schools couldn't afford transport to come and visit us. So we developed this actually quite large inflatable Manchester Museum, which was towed around on a trailer and inflated in a school hall. And you could actually go inside it, and it could seat an entire class, and it had AV, PowerPoint and so on, and handling objects, and was a brilliant way of enhancing an outreach session with the atmosphere of the museum. And we were at Manchester Museum at that time, the first and I think possibly still the only inflatable touring museum. We were also very near the major hospital for Manchester, and we realized that with some 6 million visitors a year in and out of the hospital, there was a huge audience, both of staff, patients and visitors, that were, and a very diverse audience, which we weren't connecting to. So we developed a program called Culture Shots, where we would set up 3-week residential programs inside the local hospital, bringing objects, as you can see there, doing sessions for staff around their own well-being, of course. And this was pre-pandemic, when hospital staff even then were extremely stressed and stretched, and sessions with visitors and patients as well. And all of this over this long 10-year period served to begin to say to a wide-ranging audience that the Manchester Museum is for you. And as you, I'm sure, know, for the majority of audiences, the strongest motivator in a visit is actually a recommendation from a trusted family member or friend. And that word of mouth, those ripples, really began to pay dividends longer term. We also began to do some surprising things. I talked about innovation already. We have, when I say we, this is the Manchester Museum, which I used to direct, had a large clock tower, inaccessible, very high, with views all over the surrounding city. And we developed a program there where we employed a performance artist as a hermit who stayed there for 40 days and 40 nights. And his idea was that he took photographs of a range of 40 objects from the museum. And his conceit was that he would destroy them one by one, each day, which he would reveal, unless people could get in touch with him and say why it should be saved. And as he said to me, it's actually not about destruction, but it's about surfacing the love, the hidden love for museum objects, and mostly stored objects, which don't see the light of day very often. And actually got an incredible response. So he had his own hermit social media account, and every single object was saved because somebody said this. So a good example was a mosquito specimen where he said, mosquitoes spread malaria, don't deserve to live. And people said, no, mosquitoes are just the carrier, it's the virus. Anyway, they have a right to exist, etc., etc. So it was a really good and unusual way of engaging people in an artistic project in a quite high profile and unusual way. As I said, this is a whole organization project. So it included collecting programs as well. A big collecting theme was initiated for a number of days. on the experience of migration. And you can see here a life jacket collected by our curator, who's the man on the screen on the right there, who visited a refugee camp in Lesbos, the Greek island, in about 2012, 2013, I think. And you might be able to see the background image in the case is hundreds and hundreds of discarded life jackets. It's very important, I think, that museum programs around inclusion are holistic and include collecting, of course, as well as programs of engagement on a particular site. We renewed all of our exhibitions programs to make them more popular and inclusive, including one of my favorite ones, one about the British and their dogs. And you can see here at the opening when we had examples of particular breeds, and the show was actually opened by my own dog jumping over a rope. This was a piece of work about a hidden African civilization that one of the university academics had been excavating in Ghana, and there was a big Ghanaian population locally. We revamped all of our permanent galleries. You can see here our natural history gallery actually became about people's relationship with nature, including this very powerful case on domination of nature, which was really about big game hunters, trophy hunting, etc., leading to decline in species numbers in a number of key species, including tigers. Playful displays about the exploitation of animals as resources. You can see a merino goat there with a pullover made from its fleece. We revamped our ancient Egypt galleries, and your guide on entering the gallery was a young Mancunian girl of Egyptian descent who acted as a child guide through the galleries. And we also, because there's a big African diaspora community in Manchester, wanted to very much situate Egypt in Africa as an African country, of course, with links to the Near East and so on as well. Because ancient Egypt is often portrayed as somehow removed from Africa or from, indeed, contemporary society today. And coming towards the end of the Manchester Museum example, we began to really focus on a few key audiences that we wanted to develop, particularly the African and the Asian audiences. We Face Forward was a part of the Cultural Olympiad program when Britain hosted the Olympics in 2012, and it was a program across Manchester, including Manchester Museum, about West African history and arts, which again really brought in the West African diaspora audience into Manchester Museum for the first time. And the biggest minority audience in Manchester is people of South Asian descent, particularly from Pakistan. And they didn't tend to come to the museum. They didn't see it as for them. We did a whole program of collaboration with artists and museums in Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, and Sri Lanka, called New North and South in 2016 to 19, again across Manchester, with Manchester Museum playing a big component. We developed a new South Asia gallery from 2017 onwards, and that's just about to open next year. And beginning to summarize, before I show you the impact of this, I think being free, it was a free museum, was vital, because it made it easy for people to come in casually just to try it, and then if it was good, to come again. Working with trusted influencers and ambassadors is absolutely key. Working in partnership through word of mouth, I've mentioned, but one of the key ones was we worked with the Pakistani consulate, which gave us access to all of the Pakistani audiences in Manchester, who then began to come in large numbers to the museum. And as I said, diversifying staff and volunteers is all absolutely crucial. So what did we achieve? I want to show you some statistics now, which I think is important. Here's some of the the posters for the New North and South Artist Programme to give you an idea of its breadth and complexity. So here's Manchester Museum visitor figures over that 10-year period, 2007 to 17. I left in late 2017. So we were diversifying audiences while numbers were increasing, which is probably easier because that you can expand a more diverse audience. Here's statistics of Manchester Museum on social class compared with Greater Manchester. And if you look at the bottom, I mentioned that we were targeting these lower socioeconomic groups. By 2017, 46% of our audience was lower socioeconomics, not too far off the Greater Manchester figures of 54%. We also looked at a wider indication of deprivation, called the Index of Multiple Deprivation. And this is the visitation by the lowest tenth, the lowest decile in Manchester, most deprived decile in Manchester population. Actually, 19% of our visitors were coming from that lowest 10%, compared with 22% of Greater Manchester's overall population. So we were getting very close to getting a really representative audience from those more deprived groups. Looking at Black and minority ethnic, you can see all at the bottom. Manchester Museum was attracting, by 2017, 24% of its audiences, compared with a Greater Manchester population of 17%. And we were therefore actually exceeding the statistics for Black and minority ethnic groups because of the long-term efforts we'd put in. The only area I think we were not so successful, and many museums would share this, is in disability. You can see there at the top on the left, 20% of the Greater Manchester population had some disability or long-term health condition, and Manchester Museum and our fellow institutions, the Whitworth and Manchester Art Gallery, were just getting 9 or 10%. So none of this is perfect. It's never done. The journey is never complete. And as I said, it's a long journey taking 10 years. So my final 10 minutes or so, I just want to talk about where I work now as another practical example. The Horniman, it's a museum in southeast London, a museum of not dissimilar from Manchester Museum. It's got natural history and world cultures. And part of the sort of worldwide collection includes one of the best musical instrument collections in the world. But it also has 16 acres of gardens overlooking central London, with a bandstand there for concerts, an animal walk, which is a small kind of zoo type thing, a butterfly house, and an award-winning aquarium. But when I arrived, it was very interesting because the Horniman seemed to be a victim of its own success. So in 1988, you can see there, it had about 200,000 visits, which was good, not bad. But my predecessor had developed a more commercial model involving some paying attractions and greater investment in marketing and improving visitor facilities and so on, tremendously successful. So by 2020, as you can see there, 800,000 to the museum plus 120,000 who are going to the gardens only, but the combined numbers by 2021 actually were getting close to 1 million visits a year. Fantastically successful economically and in terms of numbers, but you can see less successful in terms of diversity. So when it had smaller numbers in 1988, 40% of its visitors were Black and minority ethnic. And that's because, and that reflected Greater London as a whole, and that's because the local community came and saw it as theirs. And by 2020, the local area had gentrified and become much more middle class. And the expansion of visitors for the more commercial focus had been in that middle class area, so that the over 800,000 visits to the museum by 2020, only 18% of them were Black and minority ethnic. So the museum had almost a unique challenge, which is how to recapture something of that lost diversity. So its current features are that it's got an overwhelmingly family audience. Over 70% are families with fairly young children. Unusually for a London museum, 75% of its visitors come really regularly. And that means the museum has a very successful membership program. And I quite often meet people who come once a week. So it's possible to have a really long-term relationship with the audience. And as I've said here, that it's got a quite dominant commercial model. So it's free entry to the museum as a whole, the galleries and to the gardens, but then the aquarium, the temporary exhibitions and the butterfly house are paid for. And it's got a well-served middle-class audience. So in trying to develop a program to recapture some of the lost diversity, we developed a One World museum mission. We realized we were the only museum in London where you can see nature and culture side by side at the global level. So you can see the mission there, and it's about positivity and the future. And we're engaging with social justice and environmental justice issues. And we also, the really important point in all of this is to understand your audiences. So we did an audience segmentation project where we worked with an agency who did a large sample of the London population around their leisure interests and their propensity to visit the Horniman. And I haven't got time to go into it in great detail here, but we segmented our audiences into, you can see, a whole series of underrepresented groups, some of whom have little interest in visiting, so they're less priority for us. And then the top right-hand corner is our main priority families, active achievers and social sharers. I could talk more about what characteristics they have, but to give you an example, active achievers are families who love particularly the outdoors and doing things together actively. Those are a target for our gardens and then bringing into the museum. And there's priority adults there you can see. So all of this is informed by a strong understanding of our actual and potential audiences. And in the course of the pandemic, like so many institutions, we developed a reset agenda, which was about accelerating some of our already extant initiatives in the light of the pandemic and, of course, in the light of the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. So our priority, our number one priority, is to engage wider audiences. And as part of that, we need, as I've said before, for Manchester Museum to diversify our staff and volunteers. You can't do one without the other, I think. And you can't do this without consulting people and working in partnership. It's absolutely vital. And I think the Horniman probably had probably ceased to listen enough to people in order to really understand what was deterring some people from visiting. Like Manchester Museum, the Horniman, Frederick Horniman was a tea merchant in the 19th century, and I can talk more about that. And it's therefore a colonial museum. So we had to do something to address this colonial history. Like all museums, we have to get better at digital. The whole climate agenda is another big one for us, which we're trying to co-opt into our inclusivity agenda as well. And of course, we need to make sure that we still generated income to achieve all of these things. So here are some examples. Following Black Lives Matter, we decided immediately that we needed to address the history of where Horniman's wealth came from, which wasn't actually from tea plantations in India. It was primarily from Chinese tea bought on the London market, but that Chinese tea was ultimately paid for by opium, which was smuggled into China by the East India Company, the British East India Company, which grew it in India as a cash crop, and it was smuggled in to pay for tea, silks, ceramics, etc. So you can see in the middle paragraph there that although the Horniman family were Quakers and members of the Anti-Slavery Society, they seemed to be blind to this exploitation behind their wealth. So acknowledging the colonial history of the institution is absolutely vital part of what we do. As part of the listening agenda, we've instituted a panel of people who don't visit. And that's tricky, of course, because they'll have to change over time, because after a while with engaging with us, they would become almost co-opted to the Horniman, but we're really beginning to engage with people who don't know about the Horniman and don't think of visiting it if they do know. Our biggest diaspora audience near to us in our surrounding part of London is West African, particularly from Nigeria. And we've done a whole series of things to try and re-engage that audience that used to be a very strong part of the 40% BAME audience that we used to have back in the late 1980s. We've trained members of the local Black community to do research into our African object collections to be able to answer questions that they are interested in, rather than the ones that academics are interested in. And some of these have seen light in a podcast that the Horniman has developed called Afro Historyscapes. We've had some funding to develop a whole program called Rethinking Relationships and Building Trust around African collections, which has engaged our local community and colleagues in West Africa, in Nigeria and Kenya in particular, in thinking through the long-term future of our African collections from those countries. The Welcoming Back Black audiences I'm going to talk about in a moment. We have taken steps to diversify our board and our staff and volunteers. Those statistics have moved over the last 4 years since I've been there. There's a key part played by outreach and advocacy. We have recruited a whole series of Horniman ambassadors who are people from particularly minority ethnic groups who will be trusted when they broadcast their endorsement of the Horniman's work on their social media channels. And as I mentioned earlier, because we have this great resource in our gardens, which remained open throughout the pandemic, the gardens can be a great draw for families who feel less comfortable about coming in through the doors of the museum, as a way of engaging them with the organization first of all. So to give you some examples of what we've been doing, last year we developed through our musical instrument collections a resident artist program engaging young Black musicians and audiences in terms of the artists, the resident artists sampling sounds from our global instrument collections, incorporating them into new work, developing a series of showcase concerts, scaled up sometimes to large-scale concerts in our gardens of 2,500 people. It's called 696 because that was the name of the number given to a police risk assessment used disproportionately to close down Black music venues. So it really resonated with our particular target audiences. You can see there the statistics, a large number of artists engaged. And you can see there that 57% of the audiences were Black and minority ethnic for this 696 program, and 95% would recommend the Horniman. So we're beginning to spread word about the Horniman being attractive. And a good example is Jerk Cookout, a Caribbean festival, which we put on. 2,500 people, mostly of Caribbean descent, came. They had thought the Horniman used to do that. It stopped doing it for various reasons. And the feedback was that they thought they were no longer welcome. So by putting this on again, we began to reverse that. We had a complimentary exhibition about spaces where Black music is made called Dance Can't Nice, 20,000 visitors, again, a very large ethnic minority proportion. Here's some images of our some of our community action researchers. Here's a still from a photographic exhibition that we did as part of the celebrations of Nigeria's 60th anniversary. And here's an exhibition that we have on at the moment called Hair, Untold Stories. We have actually quite large collections, anthropology collections made from hair. We tell the story of the global hair trade, much of it starting in Indian temples, where young women give their hair to the temple as an offering. It then is sold on international markets, much of it ending up in wigs in barber shops and hair salons in South London. And it's a big community engagement program looking at barber shop and hair salon culture, touring to other museums in the UK. So to finish, the key points in this two institution series of practical examples are, in order to develop mass participation for all, a truly inclusive museum, I think there has to be a fundamental focus on understanding visitors and non-visitors and reasons for their non-participation. There has to be a whole organization commitment with an understanding that leadership is at all levels of the organization, but it has to be, of course, including leadership at the top. Data is key. It surprises me how many museums don't really use their audience data in order to drive insights in how to widen audiences. It has to be absolutely fundamental. And my final point goes right back to the beginning. It takes time. It's a long-term commitment of at least a decade. And in the case of the Horniman, because we're dealing with this unusual situation of very large audiences, to move to statistics will take possibly even longer. Anyway, I hope that's of some interest with those two institutional organizations. I'll stop there and see if you have any questions. Thank you.
Wonderful illustrations, and also how to, I think your example of bringing back audiences, Black participation, because my first time in that area was in the early 80s, sort of Sam Watson used to be the director of Brixton Archives, and some of these people. Now, I didn't realize that the numbers have gone down, and then interventions you've made to bring people back. We have about 15 minutes for questions. Okay. Tamsin is going to read them out because they're online.
Can you hear me? Yeah, sorry, I just don't know how to use a mic. We do have one question in the chat. I'll just go ahead and read that out. Could Nick say more about training citizens to do research? How were they recruited?
Yes, thank you. Most of our work is done in partnership, particularly where it's to do with expanding audiences. So we made a partnership with the Black Cultural Archives, which is a museum and archive just down the road from the Horniman in Brixton. And the funding application was done jointly with them. And we recruited through their networks, really putting a call out to people who are interested in exploring histories of African collections. So that gave us an audience we could, and there was call out more generally on social media. So we got a whole series of people putting forward interest. The funding included paying them for their training, so absolutely crucial. With these audience diversification initiatives, we pay people for their time. So we realize, of course, museum collections are quite hard to research. So there are definite techniques that one has to learn. So we had quite intensive programs of training. It was all done online because, of course, we didn't plan this, but we started the project just pre-pandemic, and like so many things, we then had to adjust to online training. But we trained them using our own staff mainly. We have an archivist, we have collections management staff, training people to use our museum database to understand what sort of how to understand museum documentation terminology, which is completely arcane, and it's difficult enough if you're a museum professional often to search and find things. It's also train people on how to actually physically go to archives and use and go in to consult documents and physical objects. And when the various lockdowns eased, our community researchers did that. And as I said, they followed their own strands. So one of the real successes actually was a young woman who was interested in Kenyan archaeological collections, because I think her uncle, or possibly her great uncle, had been one of the excavators at a particular archaeological site. And typically, of course, the publication was done by a UK academic, and the Kenyans were providing the labor as well as some of the insights, of course. And she wanted to understand this material, but also resurrect the history of the Kenyan labourers and participants. And that's really gone far now. So she's now doing an academic publication on this and an exhibition. And this is somebody who's, you know, at least initially, not at all an academic. So it's been a brilliant example of how someone's pursued their interest to really engage with collections in a way that would normally not have happened at all unless we'd both done the outreach and also provided the training.
Thank you, Nick. Are there any other questions from the floor? Anyone? Hands up? Yeah, there you are. Please mention your name so Nick knows your name.
Hi, Nick. My name is Renee. I'm from Syracuse, New York. And I was curious about the word witty on the personality traits. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about that being the first one or why that was there.
Yes, absolutely. So just to go back a bit, one of the things we did was, you know, perhaps one of those fairly typical exercises where you say, you know, if the museum was a department store or a supermarket, what would it be? If it was a TV personality, who would it be? You know, and so one of the ones that people that always came up was David Attenborough, you know, that sort of thing. Or I don't know if you know, there's a comedian, English comedian called Stephen Fry. And we then tried to say, well, what is it about their personalities that is attractive or appropriate? And one of the things that we're a university museum in a grand Victorian Gothic building. It's almost the archetype of the sort of off-putting museum. And so we, in thinking about how we could work to dismantle some of those cultural barriers, we thought sort of knowledge worn lightly was really important. So we wanted to be, as I said, you know, knowledgeable, but also witty, so that we could be more accessible, and we wanted to bring laughter into the museum. We had a separate initiative, which I didn't have time to mention, called the Playful Museum, where we worked with a sort of a museum initiative called the Happy Museum, where we trained our staff to recognize play when it happened. I mean, admittedly, mainly amongst children, but, you know, classically in an old style, austere, authoritative museum, children will be stopped from running around and playing. We actually wanted to train our staff to recognize when that was happening and encourage it, and ideally encourage play in adults as well. So that whole witty, playful, light thing was a very deliberate ploy to try and dismantle some of those more forbidding and austere elements of the sort of traditional Victorian natural history and cultural museum.
Any other questions? At the back.
Thanks. This is Daniel Tucker from here in Philadelphia. My first question is, I guess, about, you know, your overall emphasis on mass being. I guess I'm curious for you what the potential is for kind of micro scale engagements that add up to mass, or if your sort of drive is towards, you know, kind of larger numbers from the start. And then my second question was just if you could go back to your audience segmentation and tell us a little bit about those categories that you came up with, that you said you might explain if someone asked about it. So I'm asking about it.
Fair enough. Yeah. Okay. So yes, micro versus mass. It's never either or. So those small scale, intense projects which engage, which we do at the Horniman. For example, we do a lot of intensive work with a mental health ward in a nearby hospital, but that's necessarily small numbers of people doing very intensive engagement work, and it's fantastic and brilliant in terms of health and well-being and so on. So we, you know, that's a very strong element of what we do and always has been. Horniman has a long-term reputation for the excellence of its community engagement work. But, you know, the community engagement, that kind of work, if you totted up all the people over the course of a year who engage in it, it would be less than 1,000. And so but that is often, that's what I said at the beginning, that is often seen to be what inclusivity is about. And I wanted to sort of say I suppose my personal ethical stance, because I've always worked in publicly funded museums, has been that we get public funding in order to appeal to everyone. And that most museums don't manage to do that. And so alongside that important micro engagement work, I wanted to see if you can actually get museums to engage, not everyone physically, but a representative cross-section of the local public. And you can, some museums can, and most don't, possibly because, for all sorts of reasons, because of the subject matter, sometimes because of lack of institutional willingness to put in the long-term resource. It's always easier to go for the standard audience that wants to come. So that's that, I think. In terms of the audience segmentation, I'd have to go back and share my screen. I mean, it might be easier if Amar can sort of share my email and you can get in touch with me. We have 8 segments all in all, which were divided by our consultants into their leisure habits, their family circumstances, and some of their demographics. And the different titles they have really are trying to encapsulate who they are. So some of them are people who are kind of struggling and do little, if any, cultural visiting at all, or cultural participation. So it's a really hard ask for us to reach out and engage them. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't try at all, but given they have no propensity to visit a cultural attraction like the Horniman, possibly because they're physically a long way away, but also because they have other priorities, we've kind of ruled some of those groups out. Then there's a couple of groups who are people, the cultural enthusiasts, for example. They already visit us in large numbers, so they have a strong propensity to visit, but they're less of a priority audience for us. So the people I showed in the top right-hand corner and the bottom right were the families and adult groups who currently are underrepresented in our visitorship, but have some propensity to visit. So as I say, some are. So the active achievers were the people who are quite diverse socially and ethnically, certainly more diverse than our audience. And as I said, they are really attracted to doing things together as a family, principally in the outdoors. And so I didn't have time, but our next big project is called Nature and Love, which is about, it's about tackling the climate emergency and empowering people to do so. But it's about enhancing mainly our external spaces, as well as our natural history gallery inside, to try and attract those kinds of audiences. So we have different strategies for different segments of our target groups. So I hope that's just an overview. It would take quite a while, I'm afraid, to sort of go back and find the slides and talk through all of the eight different segments.
Thanks, Nick. You will have access within a half an hour to the recording, so you'll be able to access the slides.
And also the slides are available on the event schedule. You can take a look at them there.
There's time for one more question. Anyone? If not, I'm going to take the opportunity, Nick, that you emphasize partnerships, and you've always been good at forging partnerships between universities and museums, whichever way you were, and Manchester, of course, is a university museum. But how about the Horniman? I mean, what kind of university partnerships have you been able to forge?
Yes, well, our local audience, which is in the same borough of London, is Goldsmiths. So we have a memorandum of understanding with them around a whole series of partnerships, including co-delivering a master's course in anthropology and museum studies. So that's great, a really practical thing. The hair exhibition I mentioned was developed in partnership with goldsmiths, because as luck would have it, the world expert on the international hair trade is a professor at Goldsmiths, and we have other multi-stranded work with them. We're also developing a partnership with my old place of work, University College London, and particularly the Institute of Archaeology there, which has multiple museum and heritage courses. And we are developing training, teaching, and research programs in particular around Egyptian archaeology, which we don't have in-house expertise on, but they do have there. And we're also working with the University of Arts London around developing. I want to develop much greater work with artists and art practice, and so that's what we're beginning to do there. But you're right, I think possibly because of my own background, having a strong relationship with research institutions and teaching institutions is always mutually beneficial, I think, for a museum.
Thanks, Nick. And another part of your background is your initial research PhD work on non-visitation comes through your audience segmentation, where it differs or progresses on the audience segmentation by John Falk and Lynn Dirkring, because they focus mainly on people who actually are there as visitors, whereas your segmentation takes both visitors and non-visitors into consideration. So that was really very useful. And as always, we continue to learn from your perspectives. Nick, thank you very much. And we really appreciate it. And audience here might not see you in person, but I will see you in a month's time, right?
Yeah, look forward to that. It'll be very hot in India.
Well, I think it's going to be 45 degrees centigrade. But you'll see, we'll meet again next month in person in Ahmedabad, Gandhinagar. Until then, all the best. And thank you for your time, and we really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. Bye-bye.